I'm going to talk a bit about what spiritual awakening is and how to know what are some clear telltale signs to know that you are undergoing a spiritual awakening. I find that one of the things that happens when you truly understand something is that you can explain it in really clear, simple terms. So that has always been my goal with things, is to get to a level of understanding with things, where I can, not only for myself, but also for others, relate them simply. Even when we're talking about complicated subjects like Kundalini and, all of these words that we're talking about that can get quite abstract and esoteric. So I will also say that I am always open for different interpretations and different thoughts regarding spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening, as I will get to, is not something that's intended to close you off. It is something that is intended to open you, to make you less rigid, to allow for you to really see and take in the world and the people around you. So let's talk about spiritual awakening and what it really is. A lot of people, when they are talking about spiritual awakening, they talk about the word consciousness. And this is quite important. But it's easy to get to a place of kind of word salad with things or things that really sound good or don't kind of mean anything when we're talking about consciousness. Um, and so, a simple definition of spiritual awakening that a lot of people go to, and which I resonate with, is that spiritual awakening is about gradual or sometimes sudden shifts in perspective, how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we relate to one another changes. It expands. And so I think that it's really apt to talk about spiritual awakening as an expansion process. But when we talk about it as an expansion process, what does this actually mean? What are we expanding into? What is being expanded? On an energetic level, what happens when we are basically asleep, we are not undergoing spiritual awakening, is that our energy field is really tight. It's pretty closed off. I'm sure we've all met people like that where their beliefs, their understandings of reality are so rigid and so self-focused that they cannot see anyone or anything outside of their own beliefs, outside of their own understandings of reality, and a lot of times outside of their own sort of chaos and drama. And so, if we were talking about a state of not expansion, it would be a state where energies lie dormant in the body, and the person is in a state of only being able to consider themselves, um, and only being able to consider their own outlook on reality. Anything else will be denied, will be fought against, will be seen as other or something to be hated. And so when we begin this expansion process, this expansion of perspective, what happens is that we sort of wake up from our own self-interest, and we start seeing other people and their viewpoints. We start being able to see reality for what it is rather than what we were taught it was. And so this expansion process is really a process of connection. That is an excellent way to think about it. Because when we are in an unconscious state or a sleeping state, what happens is that we feel that disconnection, we feel isolation. This is probably the biggest spiritual syndrome, the biggest source of pain and suffering that anyone could experience is that feeling of total isolation and disconnection, all of the experiences that come with it, hopelessness, despair, feelings of being misunderstood or invisible. Those all come from that part of ourselves being unexpanded, being contracted. Um, and so, what happens when we expand is that it's this connection process. And what is needed for us to go into that connection process is basically a healing of our childhood stuff. That's at least a good place to start with us. I will jokingly always call this with my clients and students bad math. And that just means that I'm offering numbers just for the sake of offering perspective, not that I've gone out and counted everyone on Earth and these are actual numbers. But I would say that a good conceptualization to have is that probably 97% of us are caught in our childhood wounds. Sometimes this is due to trauma, and sometimes this is just due to the fact that we grew up in a particular family, in a particular lineage, in a particular culture, in a particular school system. And what happens out of that is that we very much get a concept of what life is, who we are supposed to be, what we are supposed to be like, what reality is supposed to be like. And all of us have had experiences where we have defended ourselves. We've experienced some sort of trauma or loss. And as a result of that, we have cut parts of ourselves off. We have made parts of ourselves shadow. And as we do this over time, what happens is that we become more and more disconnected. And so, spiritual awakening on one level is really about shifts in perspective, being able to look outwards, to consider others. Um, but on a deeper level is about connection, connection to self, connection to the people around you, connection to the world, connection to the cosmos, connection to all that is. And so I am a big advocate for spiritual awakening not being just a shift in perspective. It is not just a mental process. If we are truly seeing spiritual awakening through, it shifts our mind, body, and spirit. One of the things that I've run across so many times in my practice is people who remain in a very head space. They may understand their pain, they may understand what they're going through in terms of spiritual awakening, but they haven't felt anything. They haven't kind of gone below the neck. And so, what happens in those cases is that no transformation of life happens. Um, there may be mental understanding, or quite frankly, there may not be. Sometimes people who develop a lot of energy in the head and nowhere else. In my book, The Spiritual Awakening Guide, I call this a top-down awakening. Um, they can, from a lot of energy there, um, have all sorts of emotional imbalances happen, or what most often happens is that word salad thing that I'm talking about, is that sort of, discussing of spiritual concepts, but they're not really grounded in reality. And that's because they're not grounded in the body. And so an amazing thing happens when we go into the body um, and transform, spiritually awaken through the body. Is not only do we get those mental shifts that we are looking for, but we also get physical shifts, emotional shifts, energetic shifts, and spiritual shifts that we are looking for. And so, spiritual awakening for me, that definition is that evolution of self. that releasing of trauma, sure, that shifting of perspective to see wider and wider sort of perspectives of reality, sure. But there is also a transformation of life, of body, of soul that happens when we spiritually awaken through the body. So how is this accomplished? This happens through not only mentally understanding what we're going through, but feeling what we're going through, learning how to sit with our emotions, learning how to heal our nervous systems and our emotions that are stuck in our bodies, stuck in our tissues, um, in a way in which we go into them rather than ignore them or intellectualize about them. When we are able to sit and feel all of our emotions, even the really difficult ones or the ones that we perceive are negative, what happens is that we start to lighten up. We release, we expand, we go from a process of parts of ourselves or the entirety of our being disconnected into states of greater and greater connection. And what happens when we go into these greater and greater states of connection is that eventually those states of connection lead us to oneness states, to states where we do not feel like a lonely, despairing soul anymore. We feel connected to the earth. We feel connected to the people around us. We feel connected to the divine. We feel connected to our ancestry and lineage. We have blockages in terms of feeling all of these things, places in which within us, within our bodies, we have created barriers to experiencing these states of oneness, these states of flow that are the natural state of our being. And so spiritual awakening eventually leads for us to feel that state of flow. And that state of flow is a heightened state of creativity, but it is also a felt sense. It is a sense of kind of like a river moving through you. It is a sense of um, things going forward in your life, of just following that river, being an active participant in it, but following that river, following that flow, and what happens over time when we can find that flow within ourselves, when we start connecting, is that we will see all of the things within us that are still remain disconnected, that are still suffering, that are still in conflict. And we can look towards those, heal those emotions, heal those conflicts, and move into greater and greater states of connection. So ultimately, spiritual awakening is an evolution of mind, body, and spirit that transforms the life, that transforms the body, that transforms our thoughts. So, what are some good signs that somebody is going through a spiritual awakening? There are all sorts of lists out there, and sometimes people ask me if they are correct. And, sometimes they are. And, sometimes they might be a little bit skewed from my perspective. But the problem with talking about spiritual awakening is that so many different things can happen. So many different physical signs, so many different emotions can come up, so many different energetic experiences can come up. So I will say if you are looking for a more in-depth interview, yes, I'm going to shill my work here for a moment, is that I would suggest the Spiritual Awakening Guide, which is a wonderful overview of the path. Overall, it goes over the spiritual awakening experience as a whole, different types of awakening, as well as symptoms. If you're going through specifically a Kundalini awakening, which I'll talk about in a future video, but I would suggest my book, Working with Kundalini, which is very focused on that experience. And what happens to people who are having Kundalini awakenings in the modern world. I have heard before people talk about spiritual awakening as in anybody who is having spiritual experiences is having a spiritual awakening. On some level, I think that that is accurate. You wouldn't be reading philosophy or watching this video or, any of that sort of stuff if you weren't in some way engaged spiritually or seeking that out. The problem with that very basic definition is that it does get to that kind of fake sort of cheerleading place where people are like, if you read my book, that means that you are, spiritually awakening. And that may be true, that may not be, but this sort of belief that is packaged and sold that of specialness, that if you read this, if you participate in this, you are a golden god. That is an illusion, a predatory illusion at that, and it is something that somebody who is spiritual awakening will eventually confront and move past. But let's take it back a little bit. So if somebody is going through spiritual awakening, okay, they may have spiritual interests. They may be going to courses in Reiki or shamanism or, whatever their deal is, studying mind body perspectives. I went to acupuncture school, all of that sort of stuff. People are generally interested and educated and invested. Maybe they're interested in magic and esotericism and, like all of that sort of stuff. That certainly is true. However, I do find that there is sort of a dividing line between people who are, perhaps like starting their path or experiencing a bit of spiritual awakening kind of in the beginning phases of those, and those who are engaged sort of what I would call mid-ocean or deeper ocean in the process. So those who know me know I use a lot of ocean metaphors. I'm a very water person. Um, but for, to sort of extend this metaphor, I will talk about spirituality is in engaging with it, sort of like an ocean. There are some people sitting at the beach who are denying that that ocean even exists, even if they are participating in spiritual activities or interested in spirituality. Um, which is always interesting. So there are a lot of people who are engaged spiritually who think that becoming an atheist, essentially, or becoming nihilistic, somehow means that they have lost their ego or something. It's a pattern I've been seeing for the past 5 years or so. And what that is showing me is a spiritual pattern, a community sickness of spiritual disconnection more than anything, just living out through individual people. But taking it back a little bit, then we have people who are sitting at the beach and are contemplating the ocean, and those people might be reading or learning about things. And then there are people who start to dip their toes or their ankles in the water. And these are people who not only are thinking about spirituality, but are engaged with spirituality in a thoughtful way and a feeling and embodied way. And so, what happens when we kind of get ankle deep to going to swimming in, mid-ocean to deeper ocean, is that spiritual awakening starts to transform our lives. And so what happens to people at this point is that they may feel energy running through their bodies. Um, and this might be through the channels of their body, or this may be a Kundalini awakening, kind of going up the spine, or a more intensive awakening, like a Kundalini awakening. It can just be like a feeling of energy in the palms or, in the feet or something like that as well. Um, I would, what happens when we start to feel that energy flowing through our bodies is that It is kind of like we are composed of a series of pipes. Some of them are smaller pipes, some of them are larger pipes. And what is happening with those pipes is that flow is trying to go through, that ocean is trying to go through. And what happens is that we have all of these things blocking these pipes. They're emotions, memories, past experiences, traumas, all of this stuff are like kind of like little pieces of blockage, little pieces of gravel, or sometimes huge boulders, blocking those pipes within our bodies. And so what happens is that flow goes into those, smaller blockages and those larger blockages, and it brings them to the forefront in our lives. Suddenly we will be very, very aware that this pattern is happening in our lives, that there is something unhealed going on in our lives, that there is some form of suffering that we need to attend to. And what happens when we look inward and we attend to it is that those boulders can become smaller, that flow can go through. And over time, what happens is that more and more of that flow can go through our bodies. Eventually, the goal of spiritual awakening is that flow going through every channel of our body, every cell of our body, until we get to a point where we can identify with that flow, with that ocean, instead of feeling like we are a separate person, a separate self, disconnected from the whole. And so, again, that process of connection. And so, one of the clearest signs that spiritual awakening is happening with somebody is that the way that somebody thinks about something or someone will change. That may change in 5 minutes for some of you. It may change in 5 years or 5 months or whatever period of time. But one of the things that people genuinely undergoing spiritual awakening have happen is that they can look back, um, and see how they reacted to a situation in the past is much different than how they are reacting now. And this gets to us to the point where we're, for all of us that are old enough, we can be like, well, how I reacted as a teenager is certainly different than how I would react now. And on some level, that is the natural progression of our lives, that we naturally may spiritually awaken, that we may naturally grow in terms of wisdom because of life experience. That is a natural process that happens over time. However, that doesn't happen for all of us. So, yes, a certain percentage of the population will be spiritually awakening just because they're getting older. And as we get older, some of us grow wiser. However, not all of us do. Some of us become much more rigid, much more confined, with time. And a lot of that has to do with fear. It also has to do with trauma. And it also has to do with a lot of internal emotions happening, insecurity, projection of energies out into the other, all of that sort of stuff. Self-hatred is definitely a big one. And so this is the biggest thing that I look for in terms of spiritual awakening. A lot of people talk about all these psychic abilities blossoming, or, all of these visions and dream shifts and all of that sort of stuff. And that sort of stuff can and does happen. However, without the transformation within the body, somebody is not truly transforming their lives and themselves on that deeper level. And so what happens is that somebody may be spiritual awakening over a period of, let's say, 2 years, and they are taking accountability for themselves. They are looking within, they're looking at all those boulders, they are feeling into that flow, they're getting more and more in touch with their intuition. They are looking at what that flow is bringing up for them, what that flow is saying to them, like, hey, this is blocking your path. This is blocking you blossoming into who you are. Let's take a look at this. That person that may only be awakening for 2 years and listens to that intuition and follows that flow and looks within, takes that accountability, that responsibility for themselves to participate and be a part of that process, that person may actually be light years ahead of, I always hate to use words like that, but for the purpose of example, I will use it. That person may be light years ahead of somebody who has been participating in every spiritual, shamanic, esoteric, occult, pagan, whatever you want to call it, community for the last 20 years, but they have not gone through the process of looking within, of clearly seeing what is separating them from the whole, of clearly looking towards their suffering, of getting in tune with their body and with their emotions so that they can feel into themselves and really access that flow. And so those people with 20 years, they may have a lot of thoughts about how wonderful they are. But somebody who has authentically gone through the spiritual awakening process will have broken down that ego, will have broken down any part of themselves eventually that feels superior or inferior to others. So this is the other big sign that I look for. This happens a little bit further down the road for a lot of people. But as long as somebody is still in that state where they need to be superior to others, where they need to be, where they feel inferior to other people, where they are not feeling good as who they are without the need to be superior to others, there is further for them to go in terms of spiritual awakening. So if somebody is genuinely going through spiritual awakening, that what I call that superiority inferiority loop, where people are continually needing to play out that sense of self-hatred, self-loathing, through feeling or expressing how superior they are to others, starts to break down, with the eventual thought being that I am human just as you are human, and we can just be as we are. We are all mirrors of one another. So that is a very advanced concept, but that is the eventuality of spiritual awakening, is recognizing that form of connection. And so somebody going through spiritual awakening will feel more and more connected to others. And so this is difficult for people because when we are going through our trauma, the traumatized parts of ourselves are the isolated parts of ourselves. And so we may very well feel like an outlier or alone or suffering or not like the others, separate, when those parts of ourselves are coming up. And so looking at a bigger trajectory for ourselves than the suffering we're experiencing at the moment is helpful. Because overall, somebody who is spiritual awakening over a period of time will start to feel more connected to others, even people who are dissimilar to them. We can begin to see a small part of ourselves in each person, each being, each part of the world, each culture, each experience that is out there. That is truly the state of oneness, that can be felt and can be experienced. So let's bring it back to one more thing: signs that somebody is spiritual awakening. Along with energy flow and feeling more connected, and having the patterns and what isn't working in our lives coming to the forefront for us to look at and to work on. I will provide another definition for you to end. Enlightenment is a big word. It is a word that a lot of people cling to. I will argue that eventually what needs to be done with enlightenment is to let that go. That happens later on in the path, but there can be a point at which You are looking at this path of awakening, looking at this path of enlightenment and getting there as a goal. And then when you start to really look at that goal and the part of yourself that needs to be enlightened, that needs to be awake, and can be seen as another form of superiority. That is my question for myself as well as anybody else out there. It is such a difficult question because we crave that enlightenment. We crave that to feel superior to others, to be seen, to be heard. And my question for anybody who believes that they are going to be enlightened or who believes that they are is, what would happen if you were a normal, everyday human, just like everybody else? And that question can lead to a lot of release, a lot of reconsideration. A lot of you probably know the old saying of before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And I very much have experienced that to be true, that spiritual awakening leads to a release of the chaos of the body and leads to a state of simplicity. There is no longer resistance. There is no longer conflict. And so my favorite definition for what really happens in an awakened state, what really happens in what we might term an enlightened state, is the end of conflict. And so what happens and what to look for is this release of resistance in your life, is this ability to just do things simply. And that is difficult, again, if you are in the chaos of spiritual awakening, especially if you're going through an intensive process. But understanding that as a goal can really help somebody because we only have so much chaos in our bodies. We only have so much conflict. It may seem like we have never-ending conflict within ourselves. But what happens when you truly look within and you start working with your emotions and you start working directly with childhood wounding and the parts of you that feel this way versus that way, that conflict, this versus that, and you really look at them, what happens is that they start to release, and the more and more things release, the more and more things lighten, so enlightenment, so release out of the body, the more that this can be felt. And so as somebody goes through spiritual awakening, it is actually not a heightening of energy. Sometimes I see people attracted to people who are going through spiritual awakening, but they're in a phase where they have a lot of energy they're throwing off of them, or they have a lot of charisma, or maybe they even have a personality disorder. And people are attracted to that because it kind of gives off a specific type of energy. What happens to people that are genuinely going through spiritual awakening is that state of being okay, of being an ordinary, simple human being, just like everybody else, and a state of simplicity and stillness. If you're ever able to be in the space with somebody who does have greater consciousness or who has seen their own work through, there is a development of greater and greater stillness that can be seen in them and that can be felt well around them. You feel this potential within yourself as well. You could also call that an attunement and all of that sort of stuff. But that development of stillness is something that happens when you see this process through. It is something to look for in yourself as well as others. And so I hope that that helps as always. I always love talking about these concepts simply, hopefully, and well. It is difficult to talk about these abstract, esoteric things, but if you really bring it down to a state of feeling, to a state of emotional intelligence, learning how to feel within, learning how to be embodied, so being in your body, what happens is that our energy stops being chaotic, our energy stops being in the past, involved with all of our childhood trauma, or even, all of our ancestral and other sources of trauma that are out there. It stops being in the future. We can take that energy back as well with all of our worries and concerns. And we become more and more embodied, more and more in the present moment. And this is what really people are talking about with that present moment awareness, or the Thich Nhat Hanh, being with doing the dishes while you're doing them sort of thing. Is that we eventually, through tending to this process, retrieve our energy from all of these different sources, all of these different places in time, and are simply who we are as we are, imperfect humans in the present moment. Thank you.